slightly hushed tone. A few years ago, an urban explorer uploaded this footage from Bhairuwas, a completely abandoned village deep in the Indian state of Rajasthan. The video cuts out abruptly right after catching a fleeting glimpse of a soaked woman in the ruins, reported a highly specific side effect. For 7 consecutive days, they would hear the distinct rhythmic sound of water dripping inside their own homes. This raises a mechanical question about the nature of the haunting. Traditionally, we understand hauntings as being tethered to a specific geography, like a single house, a local graveyard, or an entire village. But here, the threat appears to have evolved into an active, screen-transmitted contagion. To trace the origin of this anomaly, we have to look back 20 years. At that time, Bhairuwas was still a functioning community, until 4 skeptical friends from the city arrived for a weekend trip. These 4 outsiders acted as the catalyst for a predatory system. Their arrival triggered a sequence of events that would eventually transform a local legend into the global digital threat documented today. On their first night, a village elder named Kamaram warned the group about Kaal Kund, a notorious crumbling well on the outskirts of town. He told them the area belonged to something else after dark. The group, confident supernatural threats were symptoms of a weak mind, laughed off the warning. At midnight, they hiked out to the site to prove their point. When they arrived, they encountered their first physical impossibility. Kaal Kund had been dry for decades, yet from deep within the pitch-black shaft, they could hear the steady echo of dripping water. Then, the trap targeted its first victim. A voice echoed from the bottom of the well, whispering the name of their friend, Neil. It was the exact cadence and pitch of Neil's mother, a woman who had died 5 years earlier. The psychological precision of the mimicry paralyzed his critical thinking, drawing him to the edge. As Neil stepped forward, his friend Samir grabbed him to pull him back. That physical contact triggered the snare. A rotting, impossibly strong hand shot out from the dark, locked onto Samir's ankle, and dragged him over the edge. The survivors watched Samir's flashlight tumble down into the dark, but the impact sound never came. The well was deep enough to swallow the light entirely in absolute silence. Panic set in, and the remaining 3 friends fled back to the village. The well functioned as a highly calculated, sensory manipulating trap. It utilized specific psychological data, like a familiar voice, to bypass logic and isolate a target before exerting enough physical force to consume them. The surviving friends barely had time to process the event before a knock came at their door at 4 a.m. Samir was standing on the porch. He was entirely soaked in water, his head hung low, and his eyes had turned pitch black. He didn't ask for help. He simply looked up and whispered, "She is alone down there." As he spoke, a thick, foul-smelling black liquid began pouring from his mouth, pooling on the wooden floorboards. Without another word, Samir slammed his own head into the stone wall with enough force to shatter his skull. Even as his body collapsed, a wide smile remained fixed on his face, suggesting the entity maintained absolute control over his motor functions until the end. Samir's brutal death acted as a breach. Within hours, villagers reported hearing the voices of their own dead relatives echoing from the outskirts. Children began entering dissociative states, sleepwalking toward the well in the middle of the night. Samir's return provided the entity with a mobile host. By sending him back to the village, the entity bypassed the physical boundaries of the well and initiated a mass infection within the community. Faced with the village's collapse, Kamaram confessed the historical origin of the well. 70 years prior, driven by paranoia and accusations of witchcraft, a local mob had dragged an entire family to Kaal Kund and thrown them inside alive. As the matriarch of the family fell into the darkness, she promised that the community would never sleep peacefully again. The entity's behavior reflects the specific nature of this origin. It is a systemic, generational vengeance born from a family forced into the darkness. In a final attempt to survive, the modern villagers gathered hundreds of heavy stones. They marched to the outskirts, determined to physically fill the well and permanently seal the family's remains underground. As the first stones were dropped, the atmospheric pressure around the site spiked. The well retaliated. The heavy stones began launching violently back out of the pit, accompanied by an overlapping, deafening sound of thousands of people screaming from the dark. Watching the stones fly back at the crowd, Neil suffered a complete break. He realized the entity was no longer confined to the pit. The village itself was now the hunting ground. Laughing frantically, he threw himself into the darkness. By attempting to crush the well with stones, the villagers destroyed the only thing keeping the entity contained. The well was a physical anchor for the curse. Once that anchor was broken by the village's violence, the entity was free to expand beyond the village borders. The next morning, the village was empty. Kaal Kund had completely vanished from the landscape, leaving behind a smooth patch of earth as if the structure had never existed. But there was physical evidence of the entity's departure. On the exterior wall of every home in Bhairuwas, there was a weeping, wet handprint stamped into the mud brick. Beneath each print, a single phrase was written: "Now it's your turn." This note map tracks how the threat shifted its primary vector. Initially, the red dot represents the physical well. For 70 years, danger was limited to this fixed spot. When the well vanished, the entity mutated into pure information, moving into the global digital network. It discovered that by attaching itself to its own story, like that viral video, it could bypass distance entirely. The infection has now moved beyond a single video file. It has turned the history of Bhairuwas itself into a carrier. By following this breakdown and absorbing the specifics of Kaal Kund, you have provided the entity with the attention it needs to bridge the gap into your own space. Keep an eye out for the water.